Picture this: a tiny hut, somewhere on the edge of a frozen valley. The wind claws at the walls and the fire gasps for breath. I watch a woman press a glowing stone to her baby's chest so it won't turn blue before sunrise. Now picture another world. A sun-drenched palace far to the south, where a queen walks barefoot across marble floors that still remember the desert heat. Two worlds, one ruled by frost, the other by fire. And yet, their survival depends on the same secret. Tonight, I will take you from the ashes of northern villages to the golden dust of forgotten kingdoms, to uncover the secret world of queens and servants. Good evening, traveler. Before we begin, I invite you to make a small ritual of this moment. Turn down the brightness. Let the room thin to shadows. If there's a lamp, soften it. If there's a window, let the city beyond become a hush of distant motion. Maybe you're listening from a small apartment, maybe from a dorm, maybe from a night shift desk with a blinking monitor that refuses to sleep. Wherever you are, I'm with you now. Breathe in, slow and patient. Hold. Breathe out, longer than you took in. Again. We start here. With breath, with quiet, with a little pact between your pulse and my voice. I grew up on the sound of old houses settling, timber that remembers winters it survived and summers it forgave. When I say, dim the lights, I mean something practical and something tender. Practical, because attention is a scarce fire and darkness is a good hearth. Tender, because softness is how we make room for the past to step in without shattering. History hates noise. It prefers thresholds, doorways, dusk, the seconds before rain. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear the low hum of an ancient hearth. Not the blaze of celebration, just the steady animal breathing of coals. Smoke and earth, fat and resin, straw and stone, the sense of endurance. That is where our story begins, not in a palace, not under vaulted ceilings or trumpet banners, but in the kinds of places that keep most of humanity alive. Places where warmth meant life. Places where silence could mean death, because silence might mean the fire has gone out. If you wish, whisper where you're listening from. I like to imagine the replies threading across a map. Brussels at 23:07, Manila at dawn. Lagos turning the page of midnight, a truck stop somewhere in Nebraska, a farmhouse in Galloway with a kettle almost, but not quite, singing. We are a temporary village, you and I not neighbors by geography, but neighbors by attention. Across centuries and miles, warmth still connects us. I like this story the way you'd bank a flame, gently, with care for the next hour. I won't shout, I won't hurry you. We have time to notice small things. The click of a kettle lid, the way a curtain lifts when a train passes 3 streets away, the aftertaste of tea when the cup is almost empty. These are the modern equivalents of an ember. Small, ordinary miracles that keep us from the cold edge of indifference. Listen to the room, hear what it's already telling you. The electronics mutter, the plumbing dreams. Your chair holds an old confession of wait and waiting. Even now, the present is a museum of minor survivals. We inherit more than bloodlines. We inherit habits of keeping the dark at a polite distance. A switch, a pilot light, a thermostat. These are our ashkeepers. We forget that comfort is engineered, that 1,000 invisible hands arrange our evenings so that we can pretend they arrange themselves. But I don't want to guilt you into reverence. I only want to set the register. The key we'll be playing in. I'm not here to accuse the past or flatter the present. I'm here to look for the hinge, where the ordinary turns and the door opens onto the larger room. Tonight that hinge is warmth, not villains, systems. In a moment we'll travel, not far at first, only to the edge of your imagination, where frost wears a crown of stars and wind writes its impatient letters along the eaves. We'll step, together, from your lamp-lit corner into a hut that holds its heat like a secret. Then, later, we'll walk sunlit corridors that echo with sandals on marble, the air bright with dust motes that float like tiny oracles. 2 climates, 2 tempos, 1 human problem. How to keep the body alive long enough for the soul to learn what it came for. Take one more breath with me. In through the nose, out through the mouth. When the air leaves you, let it carry the rubble of today. The email that stung, the headline that sharpened your shoulders, the regret you've been nursing like a cracked cup. We don't need perfection for the journey, we need space. Space is what stories make when they're told slowly enough. I'll be your ashkeeper for the hour. I'll borrow a coal from the archive and carry it carefully, wrapped in language and patience. You don't have to believe everything I say. Skepticism is a good travel companion. So is wonder. Between them, we find a path. If you brought a drink, taste it now. Tea is ideal, smoke and leaf. Coffee is fine, bitter like most empires, sweetened by small bribed pleasures. Water works, too, the original treaty between body and world. Whatever it is, let it mark the beginning. We are crossing a threshold, and thresholds deserve a token. Do you hear that? The hush is thickening. This is the right weather for remembering. I imagine you adjusting your blanket, your sleeve, the angle of your jaw. I imagine you unspooling the day and setting it gently on the table beside the keys. Here in the soft, the mind stops bracing and starts opening. Here is where memory and imagination shake hands like cautious cousins. Our itinerary is simple. First, the cold place. Then, the hot one. Always, the pulse between them. We'll walk slowly, we'll pause often, and when the past tries to convince us that it was inevitable, we'll ask the only responsible questions. Who benefits? Who suffers? Who decides? We will listen for answers not in declarations, but in routines. The kind that burn bright when resources are scarce and go unnoticed when resources are plenty. If this were a ceremony, this would be the part where the officiant reminds us what we're for. We are for attention, the ordinary generosity that civilizations are built on and seldom reward. We are for tenderness towards strangers whose names the records erased. We are for refusing the convenient story when the true one is harder, colder, slower to warm the hands. Outside your window, a car passes. Somewhere, a train. Somewhere, a dog refuses to believe in quiet. The world is not pausing for us. But we can pause within it. That is our little rebellion. To make a room where one was not provided. To make a silence sturdy enough to invite the dead to speak without trembling. When we go north, we won't go as tourists. We will go as witnesses, carrying questions like lanterns. When we go south, we won't go as judges. We will go as students, grateful for tile that holds the day's heat and walls that remember what the desert taught them. Between these latitudes, there is a grammar of survival. We will learn its verbs. Bank, barter, breathe, bear, bequeath. For now, just this. Settle. Place your feet on the floor or tuck them under you. Loosen the jaw. Soften the gaze. You don't need to see every word. You only need to feel the shape the words make when they land. Let the world shrink to the size of a hearth, yours, mine, theirs, and let the door stand open enough for a traveler in from the weather. If you wish, whisper where you're listening from. I'll read it later, and somewhere a line on a map will glow a little warmer. It helps to know we are not alone in the dark. It helps to know that across time zones and languages and the stubborn habits of fear, a simple thing still works. A voice, a breath, a story. All right, the lights are low, the room is quiet, the ash is ready. When you are, I'll carry the first coal. Before the names of kings were carved into stone, before palaces rose like mirages from the dust, before written language claimed the right to remember, there was Valmir. I speak of it not as a place you could find on a map, but as a rhythm the human body once understood. Frost and thaw, hunger and harvest, breath and prayer. I found traces of it in a footnote, in an old trader's ledger, in songs whose meanings eroded like cliffs but left their cadence behind. It wasn't an empire. It wasn't even a kingdom. It was a settlement that refused to die. Valmir lay where the northern valleys fold into one another like clasped hands, low hills veined with birch and snow-fed streams that sang until the first true freeze. Smoke curled through thatched roofs. Goats huddled in pens lined with straw that steamed in the morning light. The people measured time not in months but in hardship survived. Their vocabulary for cold had dozens of shades: sharp, bruising, hollow, honest. Each meant something different about the way the air touched skin or the way hope behaved inside the lungs. Life was a conversation with necessity. The women patched wool until the threads themselves forgot their origins. The men split logs, stacked them by height and dryness, as if order could ward off despair. Children played around steaming cauldrons, their laughter thin but real, a fragile defiance against the wind's authority. From afar, it might have looked like suffering. Up close, it was discipline, the daily rehearsal of survival performed without applause. There were no coins, no quartz, no marble gods, only barter and memory. A pot of barley for a spool of flax. A promise of help when the next calf came breech. The closest thing to wealth was warmth, and warmth was always temporary. To be generous in Valmir meant to give fire or food or silence when someone needed it most. A family's honor rested not on ancestry but on how many others they had kept alive through the long dark. The elders told stories to children the way we tell weather forecasts. If the crows gather early, the frost will come fast. If the river sings too loud, it's warning the ice. Their myths were practical, their prayers logistical. They sang to the goddess Elandra not for glory but for just enough mercy to see the next thaw. In return, they offered small things: a drop of fat, a ribbon of wool, a word spoken into smoke. Faith, in Valmir, was an agreement between exhaustion and gratitude. I imagine the evenings most clearly. Dusk arrived early, soft but absolute, as if the sun itself had grown weary. Villagers would retreat indoors, sealing shutters with pitch, stuffing moss into gaps between logs. Inside, the air thickened with breath and animal heat. Pots simmered on hooks, releasing the fragrance of roots, onion, and the faint sweetness of turnip. Each house was a miniature universe orbiting its hearth. The fire was not decoration, it was sovereign. Its crackle decided who lived and who became a cautionary tale. Yet even in such austerity, there was beauty. Not the ornate kind that begs to be preserved, but the plain kind that endures because it must. The light of embers on faces turned inward. The sound of wool being carded, a rasp like contentment. The moment before a log caught flame, when smoke hesitated, a breath between doubt and renewal. These small mercies stitched the world together tighter than any law could. No one in Valmir would have called themselves poor. Poverty requires comparison, and they had no one to compare to. They had rhythm instead. Rhythm is what poverty becomes when it finds dignity. There was a pattern to everything: wake, work, warm, rest. Even suffering had its schedule. The frost arrived in predictable moods, and people responded with predictable obedience. It was a balance between cruelty and understanding. Each respected the other's domain. I once found a fragment of a lullaby in an old archive, recorded by a traveler who passed through the region centuries later. The words, translated loosely, go something like this: "Sleep, little flame, hide from the wind, dream of the sun's return." It struck me that the mother wasn't singing to her child but to the fire itself. The child was merely within earshot. That, in essence, was Valmir's theology. Tend to the flame, and life will tend to you. But history, or whatever watches over us, dislikes stasis. When a people grow too accustomed to predictability, it tests them. It changes one small rule, just enough to remind them that mercy was never a contract. For Valmir, that reminder came not as war or plague but as silence. It began in the rivers. They froze before their queue, thin sheets of glass that thickened overnight into mirrors where fishermen saw their own fear looking back. Then came the spoiling of the harvest. Root cellars that had preserved food for generations suddenly failed, the crops turning bitter as if the earth itself had withheld approval. Birds fled early. Wolves crept closer. The air felt altered, heavier, as though time had skipped a beat. The villagers gathered in council, counting stores, arguing over omens. Some said it was punishment. Others said it was chance. But beneath the debates ran a quieter panic. the realization that their rules no longer guaranteed safety. A few families began hoarding fuel, stacking it like fortresses around their homes. Others rationed fire itself, letting it die to embers at night to save wood for later. In a world ruled by frost, hoarding warmth was treason, but hunger made new morals. When the first family perished, the rest took note not with shock but with resignation. Death, after all, was part of the rhythm. What frightened them was that this death felt offbeat, arriving too early, too easily. The priest of Elandra performed rites until his voice cracked, his breath freezing into tiny clouds of futility. Still, the frost thickened. No one yet knew that a stranger was already walking toward them through the snow, carrying the dust that shimmered blue. But I'm getting ahead of myself. For now, we stay in the world before, the world where the laws of cold were familiar, and people believed they understood how to bargain with them. If you stood outside one of those huts at dusk, you'd see only a faint glow through the seams of wood, the pulse of a fire kept small but stubborn. You'd hear lullabies to the flame and the low gossip of survival. You'd feel, perhaps, what they felt. The uneasy satisfaction of knowing that for tonight, at least, you were winning the oldest argument in history, the one between warmth and time. That was Valmir's greatness, though no chronicler ever called it that. Not conquest, not invention, just endurance. They endured so well they mistook endurance for permanence. They forgot that the frost listens too, and that every time a people declare they've mastered it, it sharpens its teeth and waits. So picture them now, those villagers who thought they had learned all the ways of cold. Picture their quiet certainty that next year would resemble the last. Picture the trust between breath and flame, the delicate mathematics of fuel and faith. Because soon, the equation will break. Soon, the frost will arrive early, the fires will fail, and the stranger will appear. But in this moment, this calm before the rules change, the world is still mercifully predictable. Smoke rises, roofs glisten, laughter flickers through the dark. The people of Valmir think they understand the universe. They don't know yet that the universe is already rewriting the script. And if I close my eyes, I can almost feel their warmth, faint, borrowed, trembling on the edge of extinction, still enough to thaw the memory of what it meant to be safe. That winter came too soon. The villagers of Valmir had known early frosts before, but this one was different, crueler, more deliberate, as if the season itself had grown impatient with their resilience. By the time the first snow fell, the rivers were already locked under glass, and the fields, half harvested, half frozen, looked like the bones of a promise broken too soon. I remember the sound most clearly. Not the howling of wind, but the silence that followed it, the kind of quiet that carries weight, as though the air itself were holding its breath. Fires burned low, wood piles shrank, and the smell of smoke thickened in every hut until it coated the tongue like ash. Children stopped playing outside. Even laughter, when it appeared, seemed brittle, cracking apart before it reached the door. The old men said it was the kind of winter that arrived once in a lifetime. The old women whispered that such winters came to test the gods. The rest of us stopped pretending to understand which explanation comforted us more. The first true panic came when the fish traps yielded nothing. The river had frozen overnight, sudden and total, entombing the nets mid-current. Farmers hammered at the ice with shovels, their hands bleeding from cold metal. When they finally broke through, the water beneath was black and motionless. No fish, no sound, just a reflection of their own frightened faces, framed by frost. The second panic was quieter but deeper. The food stores began to spoil. Cabbages shriveled, roots went sour, grain sacks turned damp from some unseen moisture that spread like rumor. Mothers scraped mold off loaves with knives, saving what they could, telling their children the green parts were herbs. By the time the first month ended, the village smelled not of life but of rot. And yet, people endured. That's what humans do. We translate terror into routine. We count logs. We measure porridge. We invent explanations that make suffering seem like a plan. Some blamed the priest, saying his prayers had grown thin. Others blamed the traders who'd passed through weeks before, claiming they'd brought a southern curse. But most simply worked harder, as if effort itself could thaw the sun. Then, one by one, the fires began to fail. It started in the northern quarter, where the wind hit hardest. A widow named Riska was the first to find her hearth dead in the middle of the night. She'd banked it carefully, as always, but when she woke, her cottage was filled with a strange stillness. The coals were gray, cold, and dry, as if they had never burned at all. She swore she'd seen a thin shimmer in the air, like frost made of light, just before the fire died. By the next week, 5 more homes had gone cold. People began to take turns watching their fires, fearful that sleep itself might invite the frost inside. Children dozed upright in chairs, clutching sticks they could poke into the embers if they faltered. But the fires failed anyway. No matter how much wood they fed them, the flames dimmed, as though some invisible hand were closing around their throats. When the last communal hearth in the meeting hall went dark, the priest of Elandra declared a fast. "The goddess is speaking," he said. "We must listen. But what does one hear when even the gods are quiet?" For 3 days, the villagers gathered at dawn, faces wrapped in wool, hands clasped around cold stones where warmth should have been. They prayed until their voices turned hoarse. On the 4th day, the wind shifted, bringing a sound they had not heard in weeks: footsteps. He came from the eastern road, a figure cloaked in gray, moving slowly, deliberately, like someone listening to the snow. His arrival felt less like rescue and more like interruption. He carried no pack, no weapon, only a small pouch at his side. The villagers watched him from their thresholds, suspicion fighting with hunger in their eyes. In Valmir, strangers were rare. In winter, they were unthinkable. The man did not speak at first. He walked straight to the center of the village, to the largest hearth, cold as bone, and knelt beside it. His hands were bare. The crowd murmured, expecting frostbite to take him instantly, but the air around him shimmered faintly, as though the snow itself hesitated to touch him. From the pouch, he drew a handful of dust, blue, almost luminous. It caught the dying light and reflected it back like frozen fire. He scattered it into the hearth, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low, drawn-out sigh, the ashes stirred. A spark, no larger than a coin, blinked to life. Then another. Within seconds, flame bloomed upward, golden and full, devouring the logs as though starving. The heat rushed outward, startling those closest to it into stepping back. The widow Riska wept openly. Someone shouted that it was witchcraft, someone else shouted that it was salvation. The stranger stood, his expression unreadable. His eyes, gods, I remember those eyes, glowed faintly, as if reflecting an inner fire. He spoke only once, his voice low but clear, "Keep what you kindle." Then he turned and walked into the dark the way he'd come. No one dared follow. By morning, his footprints had melted into the frost. That night, the villagers kept watch by the fire he had reignited. It burned differently than before, steady, almost alive, casting light that felt both comforting and strange. When dawn came, it was still burning. When dusk returned, it burned brighter. Someone whispered that Elandra herself had visited them. Others muttered that no goddess would come in human form. But belief didn't matter. The fire mattered. Within days, the other hearths began to burn again. Somehow, the embers taken from the stranger's flame carried the same impossible vitality. Even when left untended, they refused to die. Children carried small glowing stones from house to house, wrapped in cloth like sacred relics. People began to sleep again. The air inside the huts turned fragrant with boiling broth, laughter, and cautious hope. It was as if winter had blinked. The frost still ruled outside, but inside, warmth had reclaimed its throne. And though the people of Valmir did not yet know it, their salvation had bound them to something far older and far stranger than the goddess they prayed to. That night, as the village slept, I stood outside watching the stars. The wind had calmed, but the silence was thick, humming faintly, as if the earth itself was exhaling after holding its breath too long. The snow beneath my boots glowed with a faint bluish tint, and for an instant, I thought I saw shapes moving beneath the ice, currents of light, swirling like embers caught in water. Then the vision faded, and only the cold remained. No one ever learned who the stranger was. Some said he was a wandering alchemist from the southern deserts. Others whispered of angels or ghosts, or something older that wore human shape for convenience. The priests built a shrine in his honor, calling him the Flamebearer. The children, less pious, called him simply, the Spark. Whatever he was, his brief visit rewrote the story of Valmir. Fires would never again be taken for granted. From that night forward, the villagers buried embers in ash at sunset, feeding them breath before sleep, whispering the stranger's words like a charm. Keep what you kindle. And for a time, they believed the worst had passed. The frost had been humbled, the fires tamed, and life resumed its rhythm, new, perhaps, but familiar enough to feel safe. They did not yet see the shift beneath the comfort, the way belief hardens into structure, structure into law, law into superstition. But history always hides its revolutions inside small mercies. That night's flame was one of them, beautiful, necessary, and quietly catastrophic. Because once a miracle is witnessed, it demands explanation. And when none is found, it demands control. Miracles never stay wild for long. In Valmir, what began as astonishment soon became instruction. The villagers, grateful, reverent, and slightly afraid, decided that if the stranger's fire could not die, then the secret must lie not in him but in the way the flame was tended. Faith became method, and method became survival. They called their new practice the keeping. Each evening, when the last task was done and the sky folded into black, a family would bank its hearth. The coals were buried under layers of ash and salt to preserve their heat. Come dawn, the mother of the house would uncover them, breathe a soft pattern, 2 slow breaths, 1 fast, and the fire would rise again. The ritual spread from house to house until no one questioned its origin. Within weeks, every family in Valmir was performing the same quiet choreography of preservation. But routines, like rivers, create hierarchies. Some households found their embers stronger than others. Their fires burned longer, their food cooked faster, their huts stayed warmer. Neighbors began to visit, asking to borrow a handful of ash when their own fires weakened. The borrowing worked, perhaps through faith, perhaps through chemistry, and those who lent became known as ashkeepers. At first, it was a kindness. But kindness in times of scarcity is a form of power. The keepers began to organize, creating rules for how warmth could be shared. A family seeking aid would offer something in return. A loaf of bread, a day of labor, a story to be remembered at the next gathering. It wasn't barter in the crude sense, it was obligation sanctified by ritual. To give and receive fire was no longer mere exchange, it was covenant. I've read fragments of their oaths etched into clay shards found centuries later. Spirals representing flame, dots for breath, a line for promise. To an outsider, it looks like decoration, to them, it was contract law. The fire must move, one inscription reads. If it stays, it starves. Another warns, never let the same hearth sleep 2 nights cold. Soon, a network formed. A chain of glowing stones passed along frozen paths each night. Children, wrapped in furs and courage, carried ember baskets from hut to hut, their footprints marking the arteries of the village. It was dangerous work. A stumble could spill the embers into snow, extinguishing the night's hope. Yet the children took pride in it. They were the couriers of warmth, the runners of life. The ashkeepers oversaw everything. They tracked which families had borrowed and which had given. They developed calendars of heat, small tablets of burnt wood inscribed with symbols to mark the health of each hearth. Over time, they learned subtleties that bordered on science. The best woods for long burn, the mixtures of minerals that kept embers alive, the ideal depth of burial. What had begun as superstition hardened into proto-thermodynamics, though no one called it that. Each year, during the thaw, the keepers held a festival called the renewal. The entire village gathered at the central hearth where the stranger had kindled his flame. They brought a pinch of ash from every home, mixing it together into one great mound. From that communal heart, new embers were divided and returned to each household. So that none forget the first fire, the priest would proclaim. It was part ritual, part census, part insurance policy. The system ensured equality, at least in theory. But human nature is heat too. It rises, consumes, and changes the air around it. Some keepers began hoarding embers in secret, convinced that their warmth was purer, closer to the stranger's original dust. They guarded their ash pits behind locked doors, inventing reasons why others could not watch their methods. Whispers grew. That certain families' fires never smoked, that their light had a blue edge like the stranger's flame. Envy smoldered beneath gratitude. Over the years, the keeper's authority expanded beyond fire. They mediated disputes, predicted weather, even advised on marriages. Warmth had become metaphor. Those deemed cold-hearted were shunned from gatherings, their hearts left to die. The ability to sustain flame was proof of moral worth. To lose one's fire was to lose one's place in the village's memory. There was logic in it, of course. In a climate where death could creep under the door by dawn, morality had to serve biology. Sharing heat wasn't just kindness, it was infrastructure. But as the system grew intricate, something subtle shifted. Survival had once depended on collective vigilance, now it depended on obedience. I picture a night decades after the stranger's visit. A council of ash keepers seated around the great hearth, each with a clay bowl of embers before them. Their faces lit from below, eyes reflecting gold. Outside, snow hammers the roofs. Inside, they debate who may receive warmth next. A mother with a sick child? A farmer whose debts have grown? They weigh not just need, but worthiness. Fire had become judgment rendered in flame. Still, their knowledge deepened. They noticed how breath affected combustion, the rhythm mattered. Too fast, and the flame choked. Too slow, and it starved. They codified this into prayer, in through the nose, out through the heart. It was instruction disguised as devotion, and it worked. Children memorized the pattern before they learned to count. By now, Valmir's survival was no longer luck. It was system. The village endured winters that would have extinguished others. Travelers passing through spoke of its impossible fires, of smoke that rose even when the wind howled. They called it the Warm Veil. The name spread. Stories followed. Soon pilgrims came, bringing offerings, rare salts, southern spices, pieces of ore that glittered faintly blue. The keepers accepted them all, claiming the gifts pleased Elandra. But privately, they studied the blue dust with curiosity. Some said it matched the color of the stranger's flame. Generations passed. The keeping became religion. Temples of stone replaced huts. The central hearth grew massive, ringed with inscriptions that combined prayer and physics. Measurements of airflow beside invocations of divinity. The keepers, now priests, taught that warmth was a living spirit, one that could be shared but never owned. To hoard it was sin, to waste it was treason. Yet their own fires burned brighter than any others. Hypocrisy, like heat, rises fastest near the source. By then, the ritual had spread beyond Valmir. Neighboring villages adopted it, adapting the chants, trading for blue stones said to hold eternal heat. A network of warmth stretched across the north, connecting isolated communities through a common language of fire. Messengers traveled from one settlement to another carrying embers sealed in clay jars, spreading not just flame but faith. Centuries later, historians, if we can call them that, would find the remnants of these systems and label them quaint. They'd call it primitive thermodynamics, an early understanding of heat conservation rooted in myth. But that term misses the point. For the people of Valmir, warmth was not a concept, it was a covenant. To them, fire was not chemistry, it was character. And yet, every system, no matter how sacred, eventually forgets why it was created. The rituals continued long after anyone remembered the stranger or the winter that birthed them. Children recited the breath pattern mechanically. The prayers became performance. The blue stones turned to talismans passed down through bloodlines. Meaning cooled into habit. Still, beneath the repetition, something enduring remained. The simple, practical miracle that had saved them. The practice of keeping what they kindled. Whether born from faith or physics, it worked. For centuries, Valmir survived. Fires burned where others froze. Warmth traveled hand to hand, mouth to mouth, breath to breath. If you stood at the edge of the valley on a clear night, you could see it. A scatter of orange lights shimmering like stars fallen to earth. Each one a promise kept, each one proof that human beings, when pressed between fear and necessity, will invent systems to keep each other alive. They did not know it yet, but their little science of warmth would outlive the frost, outlive the gods, even outlive Valmir itself. It would travel south in the hands of one child, a girl named Liana, carried across deserts and centuries to a palace where the lessons of fire would take on a different form. But that is still ahead. For now, in this chapter of history, the system holds. The embers glow, the keepers keep, and the night, for once, stays mercifully warm. Every system begins with a person. In Valmir, that person was Mira. They called her the healer, though she had no formal title, no scrolls, no lineage, no temple. Her authority came from repetition. Every time someone fell ill, she appeared. Every time the frost bit too deep, she found a way to soothe it. People said she had been born during a blizzard that froze the river solid in a single night. Her mother had cut the cord with an icicle. Mira liked that story. She said it meant she was forged, not born. When I imagine her, I see a woman of middle years, face weathered by 1,000 fires, hair shot through with silver too soon. She kept her hut at the edge of the village, where the forest began its patient climb toward the mountains. The roof sagged, the walls leaned, but inside, the air was alive with warmth. Bundles of herbs hung from the rafters, dried roots cracked beneath her feet, and a small window cut into the wood let in a single beam of daylight that fell directly on her hearth. The fire never went out. Even in sleep, she would stir, sense the temperature shift, rise to feed it. People joked that the flames obeyed her mood. When she laughed, they danced. When she wept, they dimmed. But laughter was rare. Mira had the quiet humor of someone who'd learned that joy was a luxury best measured in minutes. She'd been one of the first ashkeepers, chosen not for status but for steadiness. While others argued over ritual, she practiced the science beneath it. She noticed that embers buried too deep suffocated, that the density of ash determined how long a coal could breathe. Her journals, scratched on bark with charcoal, read like poetry disguised as chemistry. The ember, she wrote, is like a heart. It does not burn faster when afraid. When the villagers brought her sick children, she didn't pray, she listened. To the cough, the pulse, the air leaving the body. She used warmth as medicine. Stones heated in the fire and pressed to the chest, steam from boiling pine needles to open lungs, small sips of broth measured by breath. People thought it magic, but Mira knew better. Magic, she said once, is just attention paid so precisely it looks like love. The story that made her legend began on a night so cold the stars seemed frozen mid-twinkle. A young mother named Dareth stumbled through the snow carrying her infant, barely alive, lips blue, skin the color of parchment. The fire in her home had died. The nearest neighbor's hearth was too far. She reached Myra's door at dawn, half mad with grief, the child silent in her arms. Mira took one look and acted. She snatched a stone from her oven, still glowing red, wrapped it in cloth, and pressed it gently to the baby's chest. She whispered the old breath pattern, in through the nose, out through the heart, as if reminding the child's body of its forgotten rhythm. The stone cooled slowly, and with it, the child's color returned. A cough, a gasp, a weak cry, then life. The mother called it a miracle. The village called it divine proof. But Mira only called it warmth applied at the right time. Still, the story spread faster than reason. People came from other villages carrying their sick, their dying, their last hopes. Some nights she healed. Some nights she failed. She buried those she could not save on the hill behind her hut, marking each grave with a blackened stone, ash turned to memory. She had a daughter, Liana. The child grew among herbs and smoke, learning the language of temperature before she learned to read. She could tell the difference between a flame meant for cooking and one meant for healing just by listening to its crackle. Mira taught her everything she knew: how to bank a fire, how to breathe warmth into another's skin, how to listen for the pulse beneath silence. But knowledge, like flame, demands oxygen, and Valmir was running out of air. By the time Liana turned 7, the Ashkeepers had become less a guild and more a council. They wore blue-tinged robes now, embroidered with the spiral symbol of the eternal ember. They spoke of purity, of rules, of punishment for those who wasted warmth. Mira, who had once helped shape their practices, found herself increasingly at odds with them. She refused to charge for her work. She gave fire freely. If the flame doesn't ask who it warms, she said, why should we? Her defiance made enemies. Whispers spread that her hearth burned with unnatural color, that her cures came not from Elandra but from the stranger's dust. Some said she communed with the dead embers of the first fire. To the frightened, her generosity looked like arrogance. The keepers summoned her for questioning more than once, and each time she returned quieter, wearier, but unbroken. The end came, as endings often do, disguised as accident. It was the longest night of the year, when the villagers gathered at the central hearth to renew their vows. Mira stayed behind. She had a patient, a fevered child whose breath came ragged as torn cloth. Liana sat by the window, watching snow drift sideways, when she smelled smoke, too thick, too sudden. The roof above the hearth glowed orange. Mira turned, saw the flame licking upward, and shouted for Liana to run. The rest unfolded in moments. The roof collapsing, sparks exploding into the night, villagers arriving too late with buckets of snow. They found only ashes. The hut collapsed inward like a dying lung. Myra's body was never recovered. In the center of the ruins, untouched by fire, lay a single glowing stone, the same she'd once used to save a child. They buried the stone beneath the altar in the temple of Elandra, calling it proof that the goddess had reclaimed her servant. The flame returns to its source, the High Keeper declared. The crowd murmured agreement, half believing, half afraid. Only Liana, her face streaked with soot, remained silent. She knew her mother had not prayed to gods for her miracles. She had trusted warmth itself, and warmth, being loyal, had come to claim her back. After the fire, the council took the orphaned girl in. They told her she would train as a keeper, continue her mother's work under proper supervision. But they underestimated how much of Myra's defiance had already taken root in her. Liana obeyed outwardly, learning the chants, the rituals, the measured breaths. In secret, she studied her mother's charred journals, piecing together fragments of a different truth. That fire was not a gift from heaven but a pact between human need and the patience of the elements. When she turned 15, a caravan from the south arrived, a rare sight, bringing salt, cloth, and tales of empires that glittered under endless sun. Among them was a merchant woman named Sareth, who saw something in Liana's eyes, intelligence edged with hunger. She offered to take the girl as an apprentice, promising education and safety beyond the frozen valley. The council agreed quickly. An orphan was easier to export than to honor. Before she left, Liana visited her mother's grave, a cairn of melted stones blackened smooth by years of wind. She knelt, pressed her palm to the cold rock, and whispered the breath pattern one last time. In through the nose, out through the heart. The air around her warmed faintly. She smiled. Then she stood, turned south, and walked into history. The journey took months. Through snow, through mud, through forests that smelled of iron and rain. Sareth taught her to read trade scripts, to measure spices by weight, to calculate profit and loss. But Liana never forgot the lessons of temperature. When nights grew cold in the high passes, she was the one who coaxed flames from damp wood, earning her fellow travelers awe. They called her the Ember Child. By the time the caravan reached the gates of Sethem, the desert empire of gold and dust, Liana's past was already turning into legend. The people she met in the south saw her not as an orphan but as curiosity, skin pale from northern frost, eyes gray as storm clouds. She entered a world where warmth no longer meant survival but power. She did not know it yet, but the skills her mother taught her, the patience of fire, the science of care, would one day set a palace ablaze, and with it, the order of an empire. But that is for another night. For now, remember Mira, who warmed the dying with her bare hands. Remember the daughter who carried her light south. Every great story of kingdoms and queens begins, quietly, with someone tending a small fire in the dark. Sethem was nothing like Valmir. If the north had taught its people to whisper, the south had learned to sing. The city rose from the desert like a mirage carved into permanence, white walls reflecting a sun so fierce it burned the edges of thought. Air shimmered above the streets, bending light into fluid. Every breeze smelled of spice and stone dust, of water rationed and worshipped. To arrive there from the frost was to enter another element entirely, as if one had stepped not across distance, but across the boundary of a dream. I remember the first time I saw it. We'd been walking for days, the horizon flat and endless, when the dunes suddenly gave way to geometry. Towers, domes, terraces layered like the scales of a golden creature. Canals threaded through them, carrying thin ribbons of water stolen from mountains 100 leagues away. The empire of Sethem had mastered what Valmir feared most. It had turned heat into civilization. Liana stood beside me that day, barefoot in the sand, her hair tied back with a strip of northern wool. She said nothing. She only watched the city glitter, and in her silence I sensed the recognition of a pattern. This was warmth too, only magnified, ritualized, worshipped. The same covenant her mother had practiced in secret, the dialogue between need and fire, was written here in marble and hierarchy. Within days of arrival, Sareth delivered her to the palace quarter. She had arranged a position for Liana as a servant in the queen's household, a small favor repaid for months of loyal travel. The girl entered through the side gate, head bowed, but her eyes missed nothing. The guards' shadows stretching long over mosaic floors, the way servants moved in currents of discipline, the faint smell of myrrh that clung to everything. The palace was a world unto itself, self-contained, self-assured. The outer courtyards blazed with color, lapis, ochre, crimson, while the inner chambers were dim and cool, built for shade rather than spectacle. Every threshold marked a shift in temperature, as if the architecture itself knew how to breathe. It was there, among those controlled climates, that Liana began to learn again, this time, not from frost, but from fire tamed into comfort. She scrubbed tiles, polished lamps, and listened. Servants gossip in whispers sharper than any scholar's notes. Through them, she pieced together the empire's anatomy. The queen, Asethra, ruled with precision rather than cruelty. She believed that order was a kind of mercy, that every element, sun, wind, human, could be balanced if properly understood. Liana admired her, even from afar. She saw in the queen's governance the same principle her mother had taught through flame. Control not by dominance, but by attention. Yet Sethem's attention was different. Here, warmth was luxury, not survival. The poor labored under the open sun. The rich slept beneath canopies cooled by servants waving palm fronds. Fire had been domesticated into symbol, candles in shrines, braziers in bathhouses, gold glinting on skin. One evening, while delivering linen to the inner chambers, Liana was caught by the queen herself. Asethra had been studying a map carved into stone, its surface etched with veins of copper representing irrigation routes. She turned when she heard footsteps and found the young servant frozen at the threshold, awed by the glow of torchlight on the polished metal. "What do you see?" the queen asked. Liana stammered, but truth came out easier than apology. "It looks alive, Majesty. As if heat were moving through it." Asethra smiled, the rare, tired smile of someone who recognizes an echo. "You have a northern accent. Tell me, what does heat mean where you come from?" Liana thought of her mother, of ash under fingernails, of prayers breathed into coals. "It means time," she said finally. "If you have warmth, you have time to think, to mend, to wait." That answer earned her an invitation, not a punishment. The queen had her transferred to the royal library, where scrolls and clay tablets whispered in 100 forgotten tongues. It was there that Liana encountered the texts of the servant queens of Maris, women who had ruled a desert city long vanished beneath sand. They governed not by decree but by understanding, maintaining equilibrium between the heat of the sun and the cool of the underworld. Their symbol was a divided circle, half flame, half shadow. The more Liana read, the more she dreamed. She began to imagine that Valmir's frost and Sethem's fire were two halves of the same inheritance, waiting to be reconciled. She saw connections where others saw contrast. Both peoples had worshipped balance through temperature, both had mistaken necessity for divinity. She began sketching diagrams in the margins of scrolls, spirals of air, currents of heat, the mathematics of mercy. Knowledge, however, is never neutral. A servant who reads too much becomes a question. The palace librarians noticed her curiosity, and curiosity in Sethem was a dangerous luxury. But Asethra protected her, bringing her to evening councils as an observer, asking for her insights in matters of irrigation and harvest. "The northern girl sees patterns we do not," the queen said. Perhaps distance is another form of wisdom. Their relationship deepened, not as mistress and servant, but as teacher and student. Liana learned the geometry of governance, how canals mirrored blood vessels, how policy was the flow of heat through a body of people. She came to believe that understanding systems was a higher form of devotion than prayer. Yet beneath the marble calm, something was shifting. The priests of the solar temple, the custodians of Sethem's faith, viewed the queen's experiments with suspicion. They preached that the sun's heat was divine and indivisible, not to be balanced but obeyed. The idea that warmth could be measured, moderated, shared, that it was human work, not divine favor, smelled of heresy. Liana heard their murmurs. She also heard the queen's response, whispered late at night as they walked the colonnades. "If gods fear understanding, then they are not gods at all." By then, the servant girl had become indispensable. She devised methods to cool the palace cisterns, using layers of porous clay soaked in saltwater. She proposed a design for wind towers that could draw heat upward and out, reducing the need for endless laboring servants. Asethra rewarded her with freedom within the palace, and soon the household called her the keeper of air. But freedom has gravity, it pulls envy out of others. The courtiers whispered that the queen had grown too fond of her northern shadow. The priests muttered that the foreign girl's ideas came from forbidden sources. Some said her eyes glowed faintly in moonlight, reflecting an inner fire not born of the sun. Still, for a time, progress triumphed. Under their combined guidance, Sethem flourished. The harvests improved, droughts lessened, and the city's lower quarters cooled enough that even the poorest could sleep through the night. The queen's reputation as the balancer of heat spread across the empire. Liana watched from the margins, content to remain unseen, her satisfaction quiet and practical. But ideas, like embers, travel without permission. Scholars began copying her designs, attributing them to divine inspiration. The priests could not decide whether to condemn or co-opt her work. And through it all, the memory of Myra's words haunted her. Fire does not ask who it warms. She began to dream differently. Not of frost or desert, but of a world where warmth was no longer currency or weapon. In those dreams, Valmir's snow melted into Sethem's sand, creating a river that ran between them, carrying both ice and fire without conflict. She would wake with tears drying on her cheeks, uncertain whether they came from hope or grief. The people of Sethem noticed change too. They began to whisper that the queen's foreign advisor could speak to the elements, that her presence had softened the sun itself. In the markets, charms shaped like small coiled flames appeared, sold as tokens of northern blessing. Liana ignored them, though sometimes, alone at her desk, she traced the spiral with her fingertip and felt the faintest warmth rise from the clay. She never saw how close her ideas were to rewriting the empire's foundations. To her, they were acts of service, echoes of her mother's hands shaping heat into healing. But history, ever hungry, was preparing to devour both gratitude and balance, turning them into accusation. For now, though, the city gleamed. The air above the palace shimmered gold. And somewhere deep within the archives, a young woman from a frozen valley studied the architecture of warmth, believing she had finally found a place where her mother's flame could live without fear. She could not know that in teaching an empire to temper its fire, she was already lighting the fuse that would consume it. Power never announces its decay. It begins as a subtle tremor underfoot. For Liana, it started with silence. The queen stopped attending the morning councils. The priests had grown louder in their devotion, filling the city with hymns to the unyielding sun, songs that left no room for shade. The air of Sethem felt heavier, as though the desert itself had drawn closer, ready to reclaim what civilization had stolen. Rumors travel faster than heat. In the markets, people whispered that the queen had angered the gods by listening to her northern servant. Some said the air towers drew spirits from the underworld. Others claimed the cool wind that now swept through the lower quarters was not mercy but omen, an unnatural inversion of the divine order. In the palace, suspicion turned systematic. Courtiers who had once praised Liana now averted their gaze when she passed. The scholars who had copied her diagrams quietly burned them. Even the guards, men she had taught to breathe through heatstroke, avoided her eyes. She felt the temperature of trust drop degree by degree. The queen tried to shield her, but isolation is contagious. Asethra's ministers began presenting her with new decrees drafted for the empire's moral health. One of them banned servants from handling sacred objects. Another forbade northern practices of heat manipulation, claiming they blurred the line between human craft and divine will. The queen signed none of them, but her hesitation was read as weakness. One evening, as the last light faded across the marble courtyards, Liana found Asethra standing by the great pool of reflection. The queen's bare feet were in the water, her robes gathered in her hands, her crown resting beside her like an afterthought. "They've turned the sun into a weapon," she murmured. "They think worship requires blindness." Liana knelt beside her, then opened their eyes. Asethra smiled sadly. "And watch them burn?" It was the last calm night either of them would know. The next morning, a delegation from the temple arrived. The High Solar, draped in gold, announced that the gods demanded purification. The northern woman's presence, he said, had unbalanced the sacred heat. The audience hall, packed with courtiers and soldiers, shimmered with both sunlight and tension. Liana stood beside the queen, silent. She understood the choreography of power. She could feel it shifting like sand beneath her. The High Solar continued, his voice steady and theatrical. Sethem was founded on devotion, not invention. To meddle with divine order is to invite drought, plague, and ruin. The air has grown cool, Majesty. The gods shiver in disapproval. The courtiers murmured their agreement. The queen's jaw tightened. "If the gods are cold," she said evenly, "perhaps they should learn to share the sun." Gasps rippled through the hall. It was too clever, too human a reply. Liana's stomach turned. She knew what would come next. That night, the city's priests declared a vigil. Fires were lit in every street, turning Sethem into a landscape of flickering accusation. Statues of the sun god blazed atop towers, their bronze faces red with reflected flame. In the alleys, people prayed loudly, hoping noise would prove faith. The desert wind carried ash instead of dust. By dawn, A decree was nailed to the palace gates. The servant Liana of Valmir is to be examined by the Council of Purity for heresy and unlawful sorcery. She was taken without struggle. In the council chamber, the air was thick with incense meant to clarify truth. 10 priests sat in a semicircle, their faces half hidden by veils of gold thread. They asked questions designed not for answers but for confession. Who taught you to command the wind? I learned to listen to it, Liana replied. Do you deny that you have interfered with the balance of sacred heat? I helped the city breathe. Did you instruct the queen in forbidden arts? I showed her patterns in air and water, not spells. Patterns, one priest hissed, are the language of demons. They accused her of resurrecting the cult of Maris, the ancient servant queens whose writings she had studied. The priests claimed she drew power from the bones of the desert, that her mother's fire was not natural but necromantic. They said her designs cooled the palace not with wind but with the breath of the dead. When she remained silent, they took it as admission. The next day, the queen was summoned to witness the verdict. The hall was crowded, the air shimmering with heat and fear. Liana stood barefoot on the marble floor, wrists bound, her hair tangled from sleepless nights. A priest read the charges aloud. Corruption of divine order, manipulation of sacred elements, consorting with unclean spirits. The crowd chanted its agreement in a rhythm that felt rehearsed. Asethra stepped forward, eyes bright with controlled fury. You would destroy the mind that saved this city? The High Solar bowed slightly. Majesty, she has turned our people from reverence to curiosity. The gods will not forgive that. Perhaps they never taught us to ask why, the queen said. And perhaps that is their greatest sin. Gasps again. The High Solar raised his hand. You speak treason with her tongue. The queen reached for Liana, but soldiers intervened. In the struggle, her crown slipped from her head and rolled across the floor, clinking against Liana's chains. The sound was small but final. The priests pronounced sentence. Exile beyond the desert, to walk until the sun decides her fate. The crowd cheered, half in relief, half in fear of not cheering loudly enough. Liana looked to the queen one last time. Asethra's lips moved, but the words were lost beneath the chant. That night, the queen defied them. She went to Liana's chamber, unlocked the door herself. Go, she whispered. They'll watch the gates at dawn. The old aqueduct tunnels lead beyond the walls. Follow them. Liana hesitated. And you? Asethra shook her head. I will hold their fire as long as I can. They embraced, two women bound by an element older than either empire or frost. Then Liana slipped into the tunnels, barefoot, carrying nothing but a small vial of blue dust she had kept hidden since her childhood. By morning, the city awoke to news that the heretic had vanished. The priests claimed victory, declaring the empire cleansed. A festival was held to celebrate the triumph of divine order. The queen appeared on the balcony, composed, radiant, but her eyes were hollow. A week later, smoke rose from the palace. Officially, it was an accident, a lantern overturned during preparations for the Feast of Renewal. And officially, people whispered that the fire began in the queen's own chambers, that she had walked into the flames calmly, barefoot as always, leaving only the scent of myrrh and a single sentence carved into the marble beside her bed. Fire does not ask who it warms. The priests erased the inscription, but the servants remembered. They repeated the words in secret, soft as breath, until they turned into prayer. Over generations, the story bent and blurred. The northern girl became a goddess of balance, the queen a martyr of compassion, the empire a cautionary tale told under the hiss of desert wind. No one ever found Liana's body. Travelers claimed to see a pale figure wandering the salt flats at night, carrying a lamp that glowed blue against the sand. Some said she crossed the sea, others that she became dust herself. I like to think she kept walking until frost met fire again, until the world cooled enough for her mother's lessons to make sense. Every empire ends the same way, believing it has conquered the elements, forgetting that it is one of them. Sethem's marble walls cracked, its canals dried, its towers fell silent beneath the advancing dunes. Only the wind remained, whispering through ruins that once shone like mirrors. Keep what you kindle. Centuries later, the archaeologists arrived with their drones and soft brushes, expecting dust and shards, not conversation. The desert gave reluctantly. Beneath a collapsed arch, they found a fragment of parchment sealed in resin, words written in two languages, Northern and Southern. The translation startled them. A hymn to balance, a prayer not to gods but to the breath itself. It spoke of warmth as covenant, of fire and frost as siblings, not enemies. At first, the scholars dismissed it. Coincidence, they said. A trade route artifact, a hybrid text from forgotten migrants. But handwriting told another story. When magnified, the script matched samples from the royal archives of Sethem. And there, faintly, beneath centuries of dust, appeared a name. Liana of Valmir. The world didn't notice. Academic journals wrote brief notes. A few historians debated authorship. Yet, somehow, the discovery lingered, like an ember refusing to die. Because the idea was too modern to stay buried. That warmth, literal or moral, belongs to everyone. That survival is not conquest but circulation. In our age of thermostats and climate reports, the story feels less mythical, more diagnostic. We build systems of heat and power, trade them like currency, and call it progress. Our cities hum with artificial suns, while others freeze in the shadows of our comfort. We still forget that warmth shared is never lost, it multiplies. When I look at that fragment, I imagine her hands steady, her breath slow, tracing the final line she once learned from a mother who healed with fire. Keep what you kindle. It's not religion, it's instruction. Maybe that's the secret echo of history, not punishment or prophecy, but continuity. The same blue dust, the same breath moving through generations. The reminder that technology without tenderness is only another cold season waiting to begin. So tonight, as your room grows quiet and your screen dims to gray, remember her words. Fire does not ask who it warms. From the frozen ashes of Valmir to the golden sands of Sethem, the distance between servant and queen was never real, only the distance between fear and understanding. We build walls, we draw lines, but every act of care dissolves them. Look around you. Somewhere, a heater hums, a candle trembles, a phone glows in your hand. Each is a descendant of that first shared ember. Keep the lights low. Breathe once more, in through the nose, out through the heart. We'll continue soon. Next time, we'll follow the blue dust further south, to Maris, the city that sang to the desert and taught silence to burn. For now, guard your small flame. It's older than you think.